Gestionar la complejidad no es un tema menor y los recientes eventos a nivel mundial también son un espejo para no repetirlos. Sobre esto nos hablará nuestro invitado en la conferencia Managing Complexity in the Evolving Grid, Lessons from Recent Events. Invitamos al escenario a Aidan Tuohy, director de EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute. Mr. Tuohy es doctor del Centro de Investigación de Electricidad del University College de Dublín. Welcome, Mr. Tuohy.
Gracias. Buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por su disculpe, mi español no es bueno, presenta y inglés. Gracias. Thank you all. Apologies about not speaking sufficient Spanish to be able to deliver this in Spanish, hopefully sometime soon. I'm going to talk about some of the lessons learned. Maria Nohemi just gave us some really good examples from the lessons learned in Chile and Spain. I want to dive a little bit further into that and talk about some of the issues with complexity and grid operations and the lessons we are learning as we are seeing the energy transition across the world. EPRI, if folks who don't know, we're a non-for-profit R&D organization. So we do applied research with utilities and system operators. We have over 450 different members across the globe, originally headquartered in North America and increasingly engaged in Europe, in Latin America, in the Middle East and Asia. So what I want to talk about is what are the key crucial issues that are starting to emerge as the system transitions, particularly with more renewables and data centers and other challenges. So I'll start with some context about the increased complexity we see in grid operations and just provide some initial information, initial thoughts on how the grid is changing, and then talk a bit about the Iberian blackout and Chile blackout in particular and the lessons learned there. I'm not going to get into the details of who's at fault or why, but more talk about the general lessons that are important in other parts of the world. I'll mention a few other events as well and what some of the future needs will be. At EPRI, I lead our transmission operations and planning research, so we work with grid operators, grid planners from across the world on some of these big issues. We develop tools and guidelines and training to support operators and planners as they navigate this energy transition. So when we think about grid operations, we know the grid is becoming a lot more complex to operate. We see things like inverter-based resources, wind and solar, increasing their penetration at rapid rates in many parts of the world. We see policies that are pushing that and requiring specific changes to how we operate the grid. A lot of this has to consider extreme weather events and cybersecurity issues and other important extreme events that can cause problems to the grid. But we're also seeing that there's challenges in actually building the infrastructure that is needed. I think we heard already today a few times about the need for transmission in Colombia. We see that elsewhere. But there's challenges on the supply chain issues on that, being able to actually obtain the materials, being able to get the permissions and regulatory approvals to be able to build the transmission that we identify and the distribution that's needed. So we see this issue of a system that's changing extremely rapidly, but some parts of the system changing quicker than others. And so therefore, it's becoming a lot more complex to be a grid operator now than maybe it was even 10 years ago and certainly 20, 30 years ago. We also have markets, and the markets themselves can impact on what's available to the grid and how the operators can manage the reliability. Underlying all of this, we need to make sure we have a reliable and affordable and sustainable grid, and the affordability piece in particular has to be front of mind when we think about a lot of these challenges, making sure we're actually able to operate that affordably. So some of the key challenges we see when we think about this, the long-term forecasting and short-term forecasting of the grid as we change the resource mix. So being able to predict whether it's what's going to happen to the wind power and solar power in the next hour or tomorrow or next week, and positioning the system appropriately. But also forecasting what's the load going to do in the next decade or 2 decades, so that we can build a system that can manage that. What large loads will come in? Will data centers be a big piece of the future load? Or new technologies, hydrogen electrolysis, electric vehicles, other such loads. Being able to predict that and then build across and manage that uncertainty will cause a lot of challenges for planning, but also in the operational timescale, being able to manage some of these new loads. The capacity, both the generation supply capacity as well as the delivery capacity, and having sufficient amounts of that when we added all of these loads and when we add new resources. Again, we heard a lot about the need for that already this week. But the idea is that do we have sufficient resources, not just to meet our peak demands like we've traditionally met, but also to meet the variation in demand across the day and across the hours. And that's going to require us to have flexibility. The flexibility may come from traditional sources, or it may come from newer sources. We see batteries coming into the system in record rates in places like Texas, California, Australia. Texas this past 2 years has not had as many capacity challenges because it has installed so many batteries and has that flexibility from batteries. Obviously, batteries won't be the only solution. We're going to need longer duration storage and potentially new nuclear technologies and other similar technologies, but getting that flexibility. We also may need to get flexibility from the demand side of the system and being able to tap into and enable demand flexibility, whether it's data centers or whether it's customers and small loads. Being able to get that flexibility from those sources is increasingly important. And then finally, the stability and reliability challenges. I've been in Europe the last 2 weeks, and every system operator, when we go to visit them, their biggest challenge right now is stability. We saw that in the Iberian blackout, but we see that elsewhere. So as you displace the traditional sources of stability on the system, making sure you can actually manage that stability and make sure you have a set of resources and a set of equipment and infrastructure that allows a stable system. We have to do that in the context of things like climate change, the aging infrastructure, as well as the fact that a lot of the actual folks operating the grid themselves are starting to retire, and bringing that knowledge and training will be increasingly important. So when we think about operators and planners trying to solve problems, we look at this in a few different ways, and this is important when we think about the implications of blackouts and the large events. First of all, operators or planners have to make sense of what's happening. So they take the data in and they try and understand what's happening on the system. For example, in the context of the Spanish event, oscillations that were happening. So why are these oscillations happening? What's causing them? What can we do to mitigate them? That requires a large amount of data to be able to observe the grid and understand what's happening. From a planning context, that's the forecasts and being able to understand what might be needed in the future. Once you have that data, you then need to start making decisions. And so we need the tools and capabilities, whether that's forecasts, whether that's the actual market clearing engines, or the dispatching that operators have to do, or whether it's the simulations that planners are running. Those have to be fit for purpose. You have to be able to have the models. We heard about models earlier and yesterday. You need the correct models that can actually replicate the way the system's actually going to behave. And then you actually have to take actions. And so that requires a process and the ability to invest, the ability to redispatch, the way that you actually can make sure you're making a decision that's helpful for the system. As we get more and more complexity happening, we see more data coming in. So in the past, it might be sufficient to have data coming in every 5 minutes. Now we need to see data on a more frequent basis. We see that there's a lot more complexity with distributed resources. So it's not just 10 or 50 power plants that are online. There might be thousands or even tens of thousands of different resources providing services to the system. So sorting through all of that information and understanding what's happening. A lot of these assets are digital, and being able to take all of that information in and make sense of it is increasingly challenging. Making decision-making, we're now making decisions against a wider range of things, where decisions to mitigate some particular issue may cause another issue in another part of the system, and we saw that in some of the recent events that have happened across the world. There's new markets being proposed to be able to make some of these decisions and provide some services, new various operating modes. Operators are dealing with situations they haven't necessarily trained for or dealt with before. So more and more decisions having to be made in a more complex way, and then a lot more assets to operate and plan against when you actually are taking action. So that's at a very high level, just to give the context of why some of these newer events that have happened in the last few years. There's been blackouts and been outages on the power grid for forever. They've always happened. But some of the ones in the more recent years really are building on some of these themes of complexity and additional challenges that are having for operators and planners. And so we wanted to provide that context before talking a little bit more about some of the specific events. So I'll start with the Iberian event, Spain and Portugal. Obviously, large event that happened earlier this year. Didn't happen because of any extreme weather or anything like that. It happened just in a fairly normal day, a pretty low load day. But then there was, as we'll talk about, some of the events that happened to cause this blackout. The Spanish system has very large amounts of solar PV and wind, traditionally been one of the higher penetration systems across the world. In the weeks leading up to this blackout, there was very high dispatch of PV and wind. The prior day, for example, at some points of the day, 70% or more of the energy mix was PV and wind. What that meant was it was a far lighter system, that there was less synchronous generation online. In fact, on the morning of this event was the lowest amount of synchronous generation they had online in years. They had only 11 synchronous resources, and all of them operating at minimum output. What that means is that the system, when an event does happen, will respond a lot quicker. There's a lot more potential for some of these oscillations and other challenges. The Spanish grid is highly meshed. It's a very meshed network. It's one of the more meshed networks in the world, I think. What that means is voltage management has traditionally been a challenge in the Spanish grid. They've seen these high voltages in the past and had to operate with them. It's also at the end of the European system, and so you have these oscillations that happen with the rest of continental Europe. It's loosely connected through France to the rest of Europe, and that does cause some of these oscillations. So they've had some oscillations that they've been able to deal with quite well over the past few years. They've got processes in place to switch out lines, switch in lines. They've a process in place to change the DC interconnector to France and bring that back and have less export to France to manage some of these issues. But in the morning of this, there was a newer oscillation as well that was happening that they hadn't been as prepared for, and so there's some potential that managing that ended up causing some additional actions. And then we also saw this issue of tripping of generation. So as the voltage went higher as they managed the oscillations, the voltage went higher, and some of the distributed resources tripped offline. It's not clear exactly how or when. That's still being investigated in the investigative reports, but the DR trips did cause the voltage to rise even further. And then you started seeing this very quickly within the space of about 27 seconds. The system went from having lost relatively small generation, 350 megawatt plant, to a full blackout within 27 seconds. So you could think the operators must have been under a lot of pressure, and then suddenly the system went black. So, and again, those were happening at renewable generation. They have collector systems where they bring multiple renewable plants together. And they saw this disconnection at those plants. And so very quick event that happened, and obviously had been building a little bit through the day, but then suddenly happened that time around the 12:30 p.m. Time frame. They're under frequency load shedding, what wasn't sufficient, and then they saw this total blackout. I think we saw earlier on already that the restoration then took most of a day to get the system back online. It was still a fairly successful restoration. There was some challenges and some events that happened, but given the size of the system, it was about as good as you might expect a restoration to be after that. So when we looked into this, and we've been working with some companies in Spain on the investigation into the blackout, as well as following the NSOE, the European Network of Transmission System Operators, who study this and have a report that they released a few weeks ago that just gives the facts, and then in the early part of 2026, they will have a report on the causes and some of the recommendations for future work. But we've been working with various utilities and have looked at some of the data in the region. I'm not going to, again, get into the details of exact events because it's with specific companies, but in general, we saw these different factors that converged to cause the overall blackout. So we had this issue of regulation and markets, a few things happening there. In Spain, even though the European grid code does require the ability for inverters to have voltage control, they don't actually require that for inverter-based resources. They're all put on fixed power factor control, so they weren't available to support the system voltage needs in a dynamic way when the voltage started moving around. They were just fixed, and so that obviously caused that didn't necessarily help mitigate some of the issues. We also saw there was some out-of-market actions being taken. And the other thing on the market side as well was they've recently moved to a 15-minute market, so a more frequent dispatch. But because of that, they were seeing these generators that were seeing negative prices. There was so much solar on that the price was zero or negative. And some of those solar plants may have actually self-curtailed, even though they could have been used for energy. And so there was all of these different complex issues that were interacting with each other on the day of the event. We did see these operating processes. Obviously, oscillations, when they happen in the grid, operators want to mitigate that and dampen those oscillations. They have specific processes and playbooks that they follow to do that. But what we saw here was that by following that, they were switching in lines, they were changing the DC interconnector. That actually caused the voltage to go higher, and then that ended up with this over voltage issue. So these kind of complexities and the tools, not necessarily because they weren't able to simulate what would the potential actions be or the potential outcome of a particular action, or be able to look at some situational awareness on that, they didn't necessarily know the potential for the events that could happen. On the resource performance side, an important piece from a lot of these large events has often been how do the resources perform? Do they stay online when they should stay online? Do they trip offline if they should be tripping offline? Do they trip quicker than they should have, or at lower levels than they should have? So there's still some looking at that, whether or not the distributed resources and inverter-based resources may have tripped offline, as well as this large synchronous resources, the combined cycle units. Were they able to provide the reactive control that it was expected that they would provide? We saw some indications they may not all have been able to provide the exact amount of control that was being expected of those. And then the last one, and in most blackout events, there's some implication around system protection. So with the protection and defense plans on the system, and whether they were actually able to respond accordingly. So we saw this under frequency load shed wasn't sufficient. That's a theme that we've seen in some of these recent events in Chile as well. We saw something similar. And then we also look at whether or not the protection actually operated as planned. So basically, a lot of these different factors are converging, and we're seeing this over voltage issues, but looking at that risk as a key factor. So just to look at some of these in a little bit more detail, again, this is this idea of conflicting operator actions. So when you see these oscillations, as I say, you have a playbook or a practices for how to manage those, and that includes a few different things around switching in lines, switching out shunt reactors, and then changing the interconnection with France. When they do all of those, while it helps mitigate and damp the oscillations on the system by adding impedance to the system, you also are potentially increasing the voltage. So they're bringing in more of the 400 kV lines, and then actually increasing the voltage on the system. Reducing the export means you're increasing the voltage, and there was this reduction in PV generation then, both because of the reduction in the export, but also because of the market rules I mentioned, and that does also increase the voltage. So when we think about these and the lessons from this, voltage management policies will probably need to be updated. We've been working with various members already on this, and to be able to understand what their voltage policies are and whether they need to be updated to manage these lighter load situations that are really causing some of these challenges. From a regulations perspective, again, I've covered a lot of this, but you can see on the right-hand side here, the amount of plants tripping over the past few years has actually increased. This is from a report, I think it was a report last year, but they've already been seeing these overvoltage issues for a few years now with power plants tripping on overvoltage protection, and so it's something that's been observed. They already had a plan in place to be able to use the renewables to support voltage control, but it hadn't been approved yet. Red Electrica had proposed a plan that would happen either later this year or early next year. They're trying to get that done a lot quicker now and have some of these resources. And then some of these market issues, as I mentioned before, where they're more frequent dispatch decisions are changing the voltage more frequently, and operators have less time to respond to that. I should say that since the event has happened, you'll have observed, if you've seen any of the news, there has been some actions taken. They have started trying to require these voltage control on inverters. They've also got more generation online. The amount of synchronous generation online has been increased quite significantly over the past few months. So whereas before the blackout, they were carrying 11, 12 synchronous plants in any given hour, it's now increased significantly to 20 plus plants, just to have some cautions until they actually put the tools in place to be able to manage the voltage issues going forward. So we do see this many issues. System defense plans don't always work out exactly as planned, and we need that coordination across different layers, the generation, the distribution companies, as well as the system operator and the transmission owners all need to kind of work together. We need to have that compliance with grid codes. The need for these manual actions that are hard to study and hard to understand the consequences of manual actions is something we have to revisit, and then some of the regulation aspects. So that was the Iberian blackout, and a related one I won't spend long on is the North Macedonia one that happened not long afterwards. So North Macedonia, a far smaller country, right in the middle of a large network grid, and more of a localized issue here, but on a Sunday morning, so the grid was very lightly loaded, but they still had their 400 kV lines on because they were transferring power across the system, not within their region. They had a number of substations trip offline due to over voltage protection as well. So it didn't last that long. They were able to get the system back in about an hour, but these high voltages as well was a challenge. There was low consumption and a lot of flow, or not a lot of flow across the borders. So this did again cause these voltage issues. So until recently, there wasn't a whole lot of blackouts that were caused by voltages, but now we're starting to see this come up a little bit more, and so voltage management is going to have to be addressed. And then the other one is excuse me, the Chile blackout. So Chile happened in February. I'm sure folks are fairly familiar with the layout of the Chilean system, but we did see these north to south power transfers that have been, the north to south lines that have been developed over the past few years to be able to transfer a lot of the energy from the north down to the load in the south. There was some challenges with protection. The communications channel on one of the 500 kV lines wasn't working, and as they were fixing that, it seemed there was a protection misoperation. The line went down. They pushed the power to that smaller 220 kV line, which tripped on overprotection and then separated the system. I'll show that in a little bit more detail. I think folks again are familiar with this long system with a 500 kV backbone, a high penetration of inverter-based resources, which again is very relevant here. The fast changes that happen, and when you do have an event on the system moves a lot quicker with high levels of inverters. That definitely had a relevant impact on this particular event. So this was the event configuration before the event. We did see the load, the large load transfer. It is kind of N-1 secured at 1,800 or so megawatts. But obviously what ended up happening was more like an N-2 event, which it was not secure for. We see that there's a lot of IBR generation in the north side of the system, and a lot of load in the south, so it's exporting from north to south. We did see these communication issues on protection, and once that was being addressed, then there was that particular protection. There was 4 protection schemes on that particular line. That one was disconnected or disabled, and then one of the other ones acted potentially in an unexpected way. That still has to be investigated, but that then did cause the 500 kV lines to trip and push the power to the 220 kV. So we did see these angular differences, and that caused the 220 kV lines to trip as well, and then the system split in two. So once that happened, then 2 different things basically happened on the north side. It initially stabilized. There was an excess of power, but it did actually stabilize for a few minutes. But because of the excess of power, we saw over voltages, and then it did end up leading to this collapse because of insufficient dynamic voltage control capability, again, with a lot of IBRs in that region. On the South Island that got formed, it didn't stabilize. They didn't have sufficient under-frequency load shed. That's still being investigated as well, but they're looking at is if there's distributed resources, then maybe what you think you'll get when you activate a particular under-frequency load shedding scheme won't be as much as you would have expected. And so that could be ineffective to support the grid or to support the stabilization of the grid. We also saw that some generators may have disconnected earlier than expected, so that collapsed in about 5 seconds. Bringing that system back online took some time as well. This shows more examples of the power collapse from some post-analysis. I should mention we also did a review working with the coordinator there, the system operator. We worked with them to review their review of the blackout. So there's a report from us talking about that blackout event. So yeah, as I said, the system defense plans, typically you'd want to have sufficient under-frequency load shedding and remedial action schemes to make sure you didn't have this large disconnection of plants. And what we did see was that they didn't all trigger when the early warning started happening. When the frequency did start declining, there was less actually happen on the system. So this kind of did tell us again the need to, as the system is changing so rapidly, to go back and revisit some of the things that maybe have been set for quite a while. Make sure that you've got the actual system defense plans are tested, and things like under-frequency load shed schemes that's come up a few times in various events now in the past few years, that those are all tested for managing or for mitigating some of the things that can happen on the grid. Maybe before, and I don't have a slide on this, but I also wanted to mention briefly a couple of other events that have been happening on the data center side. We heard a lot about data centers as well the last few days. While no data centers have caused an actual blackout or anything similar, we have seen data center trips that are happening in some of the larger data centers in the US and the regions. Northern Virginia, which is Dominion service territory, it's where a lot of the largest concentration of data centers in the world, as well as in Texas. Both of those have experienced situations in the past year and more where up to 1,000 megawatts of load has tripped offline due to a fairly standard fault on the system. So it's a standard fault that gets cleared normally, but the voltage sags. The data centers see that voltage sag and they move to their uninterruptible, their UPS schemes. And so what that means is they essentially look like they've dropped off the grid. That hasn't, again, it hasn't caused any specific events yet on the system, but it is the kind of thing that might also cause events in the long run if we don't address that. So there's a lot of work to be able to put right-through requirements on data centers. We're doing some testing in France with a data center there to test how it can provide right-through to a fault on the grid and show that these can be done so that we can then put this type of information into the demand connection requirements going forward. So those are a lot of different types of events, but they all have kind of those common themes around complexity. The system's changing, the system's a lot lighter and moves faster as events do happen. So what are the lessons learned? Deliberately, you won't be able to read the words here. What this is that the middle is kind of the actual specific actions an operator needs to take, but then there's all these broader contexts. They're pressured to make sure that there's they're thinking about oscillations if they start making a particular decision, or they're making sure that they actually have sufficient ramping capability on the grid. All of these broader themes that are needed. So operators are seeing more and more issues they're having to deal with. And we're seeing these different lessons learned that have been happening since these events, and I've talked about most of these already, but things like having real-time analysis capability, being able to define what the operating envelope is, and ensuring sufficient amount of flexibility and redundancy in that real-time operational conditions. Being able to think about whether or not our system defense plans are adequate. This urgent objectives piece, the fifth bullet there, that's something that we often hear about now, where people are pressured from an economics perspective to get as much clean, cheap energy on as possible in any hour. But often then you have to manage the reliability aspects of that as well. So those conflicting objectives, there's also sustainability objectives and other things that override that. So being able to think through those, and basically comes down to that bottom one, really, risk management and perception of risk. So can we manage risk in an appropriate way? Skip some of these. When we think about this from the blackout perspective, whether it's the Iberian one, Chile, or some of the other events we've observed in the past decade, often some of the system defense plans are not kind of fit for the particular use case now that they are actually dealing with. So as the grid has changed quite rapidly, often these plans have not been able to keep up quite as fast, and so we don't see that coordination across the different layers of the grid, whether it's transmission, sub-transmission, generation, distribution. Are things actually behaving as they expected? So, for example, if you have under-frequency load shed schemes, but you haven't updated how much distributed resources are contained in that particular feeder or that particular part of the network, you may end up not having sufficient under-frequency load shed when an event actually does happen. We do see this resource performance as well, both in terms of respond to a fault, but also the oscillations issue. As inverter-based resources are being installed across the world, as well as data centers now, and the electronic loads from data centers, this issue of oscillations can become quite an important topic. There's a strong need to be able to understand what's driving these oscillations. We've been doing a lot of work to identify the source of oscillations in an online tool so that you can then go and mitigate that and change the controls or push that generation offline or down so it doesn't cause the oscillations. Similarly, on the data centers now, some of the data centers in places like Texas and the Southeast US, we've seen these oscillation behavior as well. With, for example, AI training loads, the actual load on those data centers moves around quite a lot, and that can actually precipitate some oscillations happening on the system. And in general, there's two elements to that oscillations issue and the performance issue. So, some of it is around being able to find what's happening and mitigate it. But before that, we also probably should be putting better requirements in place. And so being able to have those models that are accurate to how the resources will behave, and then putting strong grid code requirements on them to behave in that way, as well as actually testing those grid codes and being able to show that they do really conform to them. There's a lot of work going on now around inverter-based resources. For example, in the US, there's a large amount of activities at NERC around standards to require inverter-based resources to behave in certain ways, but then to also be able to test for that. So you're not just trusting that they do that, but also testing that both in the modeling time frame as well as in the actual operations time frame. So compliance with the requirements is very important as we move to more and more power electronics-based load as well as power electronics-based generation. The tools, as I talked about this already, the other part there though is this link between planning and operations. The planning studies in most of these events have not indicated that these issues might actually come up, and so they may not be studying the right set of conditions. Obviously, planning typically assumes a fully intact network and then looks at N-1 or N-2, but in reality, you have generators out, you've got transmission out, the load might be different than what you'd planned for. So being able to kind of link those planning and operational capabilities in a more thorough way will be important going forward as well. That might avoid the need to get into these unstudied conditions where you have situations occurring that weren't expected. And then the last one, and I talked about this, the regulations aspects, and giving a better role for IBR and voltage control. So when we think about this from global power systems perspective, we've been thinking about it in a few layers. The specific root causes of any of these events are very unique to that particular system. Typically, it's a particular process, particular set of resources, some protection schemes, or some asset failed, some operator fault. So there's various reasons these might happen at a particular system. But if you kind of go up a level and start thinking, what does this mean globally, there's really kind of two layers to that. First of all, we see these high IBR issues. Most of these are driven by the voltage management or asset behavior, basically that change in the system, that it's become a far lighter system. There's less large synchronous resources, so the system responds a lot quicker. We also can't see what's happening with all these resources when some of them are distributed resources. But beyond that, again, even beyond just the IBR issue, there's this broader universal learnings around conflicting objectives. The IBRs are there often because of some policy requirements, and being able to mitigate reliability issues while meeting some policy or societal desires is often something that can cause us to get misaligned on the way we operate the grid. This issue of new conditions, new unstudied operating conditions, and having operators trained to be able to manage that and respond to that is important. The markets I talked about. And then last one maybe we haven't touched on yet, but the data and organizational models. So often what we find with these is that the data wasn't able to find its way into the control room in an appropriate way at the appropriate time. As you look at the European event, they're still trying to get data from a lot of the generators and distribution companies, even this many months after a very large event. And so managing that data is becoming more and more challenging as there's more and more owners of the data. There's generator companies, transmission companies, distribution, customers themselves now may have quite a lot of this data. So bringing all of that together is a key issue and a key thing we can work on. And then if we do that, we can also use things like AI tools and use these new capabilities to be able to manage that and to be able to use that to predict events and see what might happen and help identify mitigations. But until it's all together in some way that we can actually use in an organized way, it's hard to do anything. And then the organizational models there, what I'm talking about here is more things like distribution, transmission, coordination, coordinating between TSO and DSO, coordinating among neighboring transmission companies to be able to make sure that if one person's taking action on a particular issue, that's communicated well with the rest of the stakeholders on the grid and not causing unexpected problems because people didn't realize a particular line had some protection problems or similar. So there's a need to kind of update how we think about organizational models and organizational practices. So as we've looked at those issues, we then start looking at these emerging trends, the complexity, the market alignment, the resource performance, and these unforeseen conditions. We've been taking that then to try and look at, well, what does that actually need? So what we've been trying to launch here in the next few months is this concept of a grid vulnerability framework. So EPRI works with operators and utilities across the world, and hearing from them, it's not just specific tools. We obviously need tools to manage oscillations or tools to set reserve requirements or whatever the case may be. But there's also a broader need to look at where the risks happening on the system. The risks that are happening in the future are not the same risks as happened previously. If we just address what happened in the Chilean blackout or the Iberian blackout, it won't matter for your particular system. The failure modes or the things that could go wrong here or anywhere in the world will be different, and they will change as well as the system changes. So what we think we need is a better way to think about vulnerability and risk on the grid, and use that then to actually be able to rapidly transition the capabilities that operators and planners and others in the generation companies and others actually have to be able to respond to the events and to the changes in the system. That's going to require some advanced tools. We know there's a need for things like using phasor measurement unit data. We know there's going to be a need to be able to use artificial intelligence and use that to do things like alarm management, or use that to do things like being able to assess whether we're getting closer to the edge on stability issues. We've been working with partners to test various new AI tools to look at stability issues and whether or not we're getting closer to an event happening on the grid. And then training, I think I saw that a few times as well today, that the need for training for grid operators. Obviously there's the more fundamental training for how your grid processes work, but there's also this broader training of how to manage in a rapidly changing environment, and as you get unseen conditions, how are you able to respond to that? So we see all of these needs as coming out. So the top two are kind of more strategic and high level, and then the more tactical tool and training type issues. So we're looking to launch this large initiative over the next 3 years to be able to look at this and address these challenges. I won't dwell on that for too long. It'll have these different pieces that I've already mentioned, where we're going to try and develop roadmaps for how do operators and planners need to be set up to meet that future grid needs. What are the tools that we will need to manage high IBR grids, and then what is the training? So I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all. Gracias.